Butler and 3L Sarah Fishman, who really ran away with it. So they have my tremendous gratitude. They have put together this incredible panel for all of you. And I'm going to turn this over to Professor Butler to moderate and leave you all in her capable hands. Thank you so much for coming.
All right, thanks everybody. For being here, and thank you to all the panelists who agreed to come and speak with us all today. Before I jump into bios and everything, I just want to point out there are QR codes sort of scattered around, and there's also that URL on the board. If you have questions that you want to submit, I'm collecting them all on a Google form in front of me. So just as we're going, feel free to submit any questions. And then I will work it into the questions that I give to the panel. So I recognize some faces. Some of you already know me as an assistant professor of law here. I teach constitutional law, civil rights, critical race theory, and gender law. So I primarily think of myself as a constitutional law scholar with an emphasis in those areas. I think I'm going to start introducing the panelists at that end and come this way. So we're joined by Jason Starr. He has over a decade of experience as an attorney, educator, organizer, and innovator in civil rights and social justice policy. Currently, Jason is the inaugural director of litigation at the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest LGBT civil rights organization, where he is building a strategic hub for collaborative pro bono impact litigation in partnership with private law firms and grassroots legal activists. He serves as lead counsel in Walker v. Azar, challenging the former Trump administration's attempted rollback of critical civil rights protections for LGBTQ people in the Affordable Care Act, and Deanne v. DeSantis et al., challenging discriminatory state laws targeting transgender youth and families in Florida and Tennessee, respectively. He also represents amici on a number of high-profile cases addressing LGBTQ equality, state and federal court. Formerly, Jason served as counsel for civil rights and federal affairs in the New York State Executive Chamber, where he managed legal policy and budgetary affairs for a broad portfolio of issues, including criminal justice, clemency, democracy, protection, immigration, and housing. Jason was also counsel to both the Governor's Task Force on Reentry and Community Reintegration and Joint Task Force on Worker Exploitation and Employee Misclassification. On Zoom, because I know on Zoom it can feel a little bit lonely. So I want to introduce Stacy and Lee Pace. They are both the founders of Spectrum, the other clinic. Stacy was born on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, lived there for most of her life. She graduated from Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College with her registered nurse associate degree in nursing, and jumped straight into nursing, worked for about 7 years as a registered nurse, starting out briefly as a medical surgical ward before moving on to the emergency department. After working as an RN for several years, she returned to school at the University of South Alabama to obtain her RN BSN, and then returned again for her RN MSN in primary care as an adult nurse practitioner with a focus on internal medicine. She then practiced as an NP for several years before returning to school at the University of Pennsylvania for a postmaster's in acute care. She's worked in both outpatient and inpatient medicine settings during her career as a nurse practitioner, most recently as a hospitalist. She has always been a staunch ally for the LGBTQ+ community and believes everyone should have a chance to live as their true selves. Lee Pace was born and raised in New Orleans. I didn't see him able to wave to us. Great. Has a hand in many different trades throughout the years until finding his calling out in Spectrum. He began as a diesel mechanic before moving into the realm of healthcare. After working for 16 years as an occupational therapist, he sought a career as a paramedic, and then afterward became a registered nurse. He returned to school at Belmont University after working for 3 years in nursing to pursue his career as a nurse practitioner. Since passing his boards, he has worked in many areas: family practice, urgent care, hospital medicine, with the majority of his practice being spent in the emergency department. He's worked hard to build Spectrum and continues with further efforts in his latest project to establish a nonprofit that will assist transgender and non-conforming people financially in affording their hormone replacement therapy, educate and advocate for this community, and provide a safe space for gathering. Then next, live, we have Sarah Schmaidman. She earned her bachelor's degree in education from Baylor, her master's in linguistics from SUNY at Buffalo. She's a third-year law student here at the University of Mississippi School of Law. She's an active leader in the trans program, Transgender Resources Advocacy Network and Support. She's the Community Engagement Committee co-chair for the Human Rights Campaign of Mississippi, a trustee for the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Oxford, serves on the Dean's Leadership Council as co-chair for the 1L Mentorship Program, and is the Secretary of Outlaw. Following the 2022 graduation, Sarah will sit in the Mississippi Bar exam. And then we are also joined by Isaiah Wilson. He graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in 2019 with a Bachelor of Arts in Women's and Gender Studies. Prior to joining the Center for Inclusion and Cross-Cultural Engagement team here on campus, Isaiah worked in Boston with Roxbury Youth Works, Inc. as a case manager, working with the UCF-involved transgender, non-binary, and non-conforming youth, as well as cisgender men who are at risk for and had previously been exploited. Isaiah has been a part of training and running workshops for medical professionals, social workers, coaches, and teachers to create inclusive and more welcoming environments. In 2020, Isaiah moved to Taiwan to teach English and learn Chinese. He currently works as a coordinator for LGBTQIA+ programming and initiatives again here on campus. In this role, he is creating programs and events to engage LGBTQIA+ community on campus and sitting in many meetings to create a more welcoming and inclusive campus through policy and procedures. And last but not least, we have CJ Winship, 2L here on campus from Laurel, Mississippi. She got her undergraduate degree in criminology from Mississippi State in 2013, while she represented the Bulldog soccer team as a goalkeeper. Upon graduation, she began her career as a police officer with the Starkville Police Department. After marrying her wife in 2019, she transferred to South Haven Police Department, where she remained until she finished her master's degree in business administration and was accepted to Ole Miss Law School. At Ole Miss, she was involved in the Mississippi Innocence Project, the Student Honor Council, and the Public Interest Law Foundation Outlaw. So quickly, I'd love to have a round of applause. So today, we're gathered because every year we do something for Constitution Day. And the U.S. Constitution is a fundamental framework of America's system of government. It lays out the purposes and duties of each branch of the federal government and the rights and liberties of the people. One of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th Amendment, was adopted after the Civil War, and among other things, guarantees the equal protection of the laws, has been interpreted to protect substantive rights to due process, which include protections for life, liberty, and property. It is also because of the 14th Amendment that state governments are required to respect rights, containing protections like freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. Transgender athletes, their allies, and their opponents ultimately all lean on the protections and purposes of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause as the basis for their arguments for or against transgender athlete participation in the sex-segregated sports teams of the athlete's choice. For athletes who are also attending educational programs that receive federal funding, the Department of Education confirmed that their interpretations of Title IX provide statutory protections for transgender athletes to participate in sports teams of their choice. As will be discussed later in this panel, this interpretation is largely the result of the Supreme Court case Bostock v. Clayton County, Georgia, which came down in 2020, which interpreted the Title VII prohibition of employment discrimination on the basis of sex to encompass sexual orientation and gender identity. Congress had passed Title IX according to their spending power and is also arguably permissible through their enforcement powers under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. Title IX, which was passed in 1972, was necessary at that time because of rampant discrimination against women in educational institutions. Its purpose was to avoid the use of federal resources to support sexually discriminatory practices and to provide individual citizens effective protection against discriminatory practices. While not specifically mentioning athletics, the relevant regulations made it clear that educational programs that receive public funding are required to provide an equal opportunity to play sports. Title IX has allowed women and girls to challenge the old narrative that excessive physical activity was dangerous, put too much strain on girls, and created a public spectacle. Women and girls, now better supported by the principles of equal protection and the commands of government intervention, have been able to show that they are fully capable of sports competition. There are several states who have attempted to, as we'll talk about, or have been successful in passing legislation that excludes transgender women and girls, and sometimes transgender boys and men, from participating in the sex-segregated sport of their choice. The arguments underlying these bills is that new legislation will help support cisgender women and girls because women and girls fought so hard to be properly included in sports. So the question often is, why is it fair that someone who was born with a physical advantage should get to compete against them? Like most things, nuance is necessary. For one thing, not all cisgender women agree on whether sex-segregated sports are a good idea. Some argue that segregating sports on that basis perpetuates a harmful narrative that women are per se inferior to men, and doesn't take into account sports where women have demonstrated they may have their own physical advantage, like in ultra marathons. It also fails to challenge unproven assumptions and gender stereotypes, or prioritizes physical abilities where men excel, instead of prioritizing abilities where women excel, or where sex or gender are relevant to performance, like shooting, fencing, and more. Some people argue the real problem requiring legislative action are the demonstrable ways in which women's sports are devalued, such as disparities in men and women's coach pay, disparities in pay in men and women's sports, disparities in the availability of institutional support in men and women's sports, and more. So today our panelists will address legal, medical, and social issues around this topic. So definitely continue to submit your questions via the Google link. I see somebody's done that already, which is great. And yeah, so great, let us get started. One of the things that I wanted us to start with is sort of this foundational question, and I will call on Isaiah for this. Could you give us sort of like a gender identity 101, so that we're all sort of starting in the same place?
Sure. So gender is when you wake up in the morning and you picture yourself in the world and you picture your own existence, the way you picture yourself is your gender. And we'll talk about sex later, so I'm going to talk about it here now. Sex is the physical characteristics that you have and are what the doctor looked at you when you were born and said whether or not you were male or female. And it isn't related or the same thing as your gender. And that's where we have like cisgender people and transgender people. So transgender people are people whose gender identity is different from what the doctor said the day they were born. And cisgender people are people whose gender is the same as what they were assigned the day that they were born. I guess that's a really good one. Thank you. Okay, good.
Yeah, I love that quick and dirty.
Yeah.
101.
I can tell you more. That's good.
Yeah, if it comes up, definitely, if you have more questions about it, definitely ask. So I'm interested in sort of learning from the PACEs, and again, Isaiah too, if you have something to add to what the PACEs have to say, but could you tell us a little bit about public perceptions of fairness and, you know, why we should sort of view this as an equality issue? I think especially given, I think a lot of people's questions sort of come along with that sex assigned at birth and how somebody's gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth and how that can impact fairness. And you are muted.
Okay. Yeah, I was like, are you asking us or asking them? Sorry. So yeah, public perception is pretty trashy for trans folks. A lot of times historically, you will see that transgender people are portrayed in movies and just about any of our cultural to-dos as jokes. People like to laugh at them. You know, it's always, you know, someone goes to kiss a girl and, oh no, you know, quote, it's a guy, or, you know, whatever. That's what we see in these movies and things, and everybody laughs and makes them a joke. And people tend to focus on that a lot because, I mean, transgender people don't take up much of the population. So a lot of folks that, you know, they just haven't encountered trans people. They haven't talked to them. They haven't, you know, learned anything about them in school for certain. And so their perception is shaped by what they see in media and, you know, movies and things. and they react that way. So when people see, you know, oh, trans women want to participate in sports, the first thing that pops into their mind is, oh, this big, you know, huge man in a dress. That's generally what you see in movies, what they're making fun of. It's always trans women that's being made fun of. It's hardly ever going to be trans guys you see that are made fun of, although it does happen. And so this public perception is extremely harmful to folks, you know, and I wish we could change it around, you know, lickety split, but that is not going to happen. Anyway, sorry if I rambled. What else could I tell you about that? Sorry.
No, that's great. I think that's a great lead up to sort of this question of like, you know, how maybe that pop culture grounding has sort of impacted the way people think about, you know, trans athletes inclusion in sports. Yeah. Did you want to say more about that?
No, I find that tends to be what people think of. You know, they pull up religion, of course, which I've yet to find anywhere in the Bible that reliably says that transgender people are bad, but whatever. They pull that up, and they also pull up this stuff that they see in the media as what they have in their mind to represent transgender people, when it's just completely off base from what reality is. But again, it's hard to well, I mean, I can blame them, but it's just that, you know, there's just no good representation out there for us in, you know, just public school systems or anywhere really. It's like, if you want to learn about trans people, you have to go above and beyond on your own to seek out this knowledge. Nobody's just going to put it in front of you like how they do cisgender education in, you know, elementary schools, where they say, okay, let's separate the boys and girls into different classes and we're going to learn about different parts. Nobody ever talks about the LGBT portion of growth and development. So I think that's extremely harmful to our country.
Yeah, thank you, Isaiah.
Yeah, I agree. Like, public perception is that we're going to have like these young men who have like gone through puberty and are men, and they want to pretend to be women to like dominate in that sport. And I think that's doing a disservice to like this culture that we have of like toxic masculinity. It doesn't improve my manliness or prove that I'm a really good athlete if I went and I played with people that weren't as good. And also in terms of like fairness, when we're looking at middle school and high school sports, in high school, you're from the age like 14 up until like at 21, you can no longer be in high school. So really up to 21, most people graduate at 18 or 19, but in the reality is you can stay in high school till you're 21. So we have schooling that's 14 to 21-year-olds. And so on the same teams, I can have a 14-year-old who hasn't even gotten a single chest hair with a 19, 20, 21-year-old who has had lots of coaching and experience working out in their sport. And so is that really fair? And so that's not even looking at it being like a trans issue. It's just, what is the purpose of middle school and high school sports? It's just to give people an opportunity to feel like they belong and to be a part of a team. That's where most of us learn how to be a part of a group and to work together for a common goal. And so the fairness it shouldn't be about what is your assigned sex at birth. It should be whether or not like there's a team that you can participate with. If we really wanted it to be about physical advantages, we wouldn't allow any freshmen at any point to ever play any sport. We wouldn't allow most sophomores to play sports. We would only say seniors can play. And we know that wouldn't be fair. We know that wouldn't really accomplish what we want out of like our high school sports. We want people to be able to participate, and having like State Bill 2536 that says that like trans girls can't play on the same team. All it's doing is meaning that they're going to miss out on the opportunity of being able to be with their peers and to build these skills that you need. Most of us have been to or in college or in law school. You have to get good at working in a group. And I know I couldn't work in a group if I wasn't on a basketball team. In like terms of a personal example too, is like when we look at a basketball team, my brother's 6 feet tall and I'm 5'7" wearing Air Maxes. So it adds like 1.5 inches. So that tells you a lot. I'm a significantly better basketball player than he was, even though he's 6 feet tall and he was 6 feet tall in high school. But because of who I am, I still played on the girls' team, even though I could have played with the boys at that time. And he still played on the boys' team. Stayed on the freshman team next year. I know he's watching, so I'm sorry, Michael. Sorry, but not really. So, but the reality is like, why, if we know that like I was a better athlete at that point and my gender identity was perceived as one thing, and I still played on the girls' team, and he's a boy going through like a masculine puberty and wasn't as good, we can tell right there with just the same people with the same genetics that your gender doesn't really matter in terms of how good you are, how fair it is to be to play a game.
Thanks so much. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add one point to that, because in law, we often talk about intent. And I'd like to talk about intent from the perspective of the trans female. And I don't assume to represent the whole class of trans females, but I can tell you from my own perspective is this idea that people say, oh, you know, trans female is a guy that's trying to be on a female team for whatever reason. There's nefarious purposes, you know, whatever you can throw there. But the intent of a trans female to be on a female team is because that's what aligns with their identity. That's who they are. It's not this, I want to be, you know, I want to whatever the fill in the blank, but it's this, that's where I belong. And it's not even saying that all females are gonna accept, you know, and are gonna, you know, welcome in open arms. There might be some challenges there too. And so this you have to also look at it from the intent of the person that's affected as well.
I definitely want to ask Jason sort of like, why do you view this as a constitutional issue? And I think one of the questions that had come in, which I think may link to this question, is, you know, one of the common dissents for transgender inclusion is the protection of women's sports. So do you see an imbalance created by inclusion and sort of connecting back to the constitutionality of these laws?
No, to answer the second question first, you know, trans women and girls are women and girls, trans men and boys are men and boys. And so to the extent the Constitution tolerates sex segregation, including transgender athletes, providing access, in this case, to educational athletic opportunities, but any opportunity is consistent with what the Constitution requires or recognizes. As to the first question, why this is a constitutional issue, you know, I think it goes back to your introduction. You know, the 14th Amendment goes to the heart of what it means to have citizenship in this country. What we are citizens of our state, we are citizens of these United States. When we look at the history of the 14th Amendment, it was really about, you know, restoring, you know, my ancestors to full citizenship. And there are many conversations about what needed to happen constitutionally and practically in order for that to happen. But it was really about a population of people who were recognized as United States citizens, but who were targeted by their states and treated as something other than that. And that's really what these bills are about. They're about power, not policy. They are solutions in search of a problem that create more problems. And it's really about codifying discrimination against a group of people to exercise majoritarian power. And where but the Constitution can the individual go when the state aggresses against what it means to be, you know, fully me as an American citizen. So, you know, we find, you know, we seek and hopefully will find recourse, of course, in the 14th Amendment and in the Equal Protection Clause, where we see a lot of where a lot of my litigation on these issues is right now. But I think they also raise very interesting questions in their enforcement. I mean, what does it look like when someone's gender identity or appropriate placement on a particular team is challenged? What kinds of exposure will the state require? What kinds of intrusions on their bodily integrity, on their person will occasion the enforcement of these laws? So their very existence, the codification of this second-class citizenship, or at least this expression thereof, certainly finds or should find recourse in the Equal Protection Clause. But we also have other sort of core constitutional rights. So you'll see in our cases, in other cases that our colleagues bring across the country, you know, arguments under the Due Process Clause, for example, because of the ways in which the enforcement of these laws might infringe upon core rights of privacy. So I think this is an interesting constitutional question or constitutional issue, because we are getting at some of these constitutional foundations that undergird so many other individual rights that happen to, in some places, also be the target of the majority. So I think it's properly placed as a reflection of the current sort of political, social moment that we're in, where transgender people and transgender youth specifically are being targeted by majoritarian politics in some places. But I also think it's important for us as litigators and as folks who are the guardians of constitutional jurisprudence to recognize that these arguments also have salience and are really important as we think about other issues of individual liberty that are also at risk politically as well.
Great, thank you. And I think, you know, I think there's often a really interesting tension in an issue like this. So like what the law is, what the law should be, what people are trying to make the law. And sometimes there's a tension with what is or is not actually happening on the ground and with people's individual experiences. So like I also want to, you know, pass the mic to CJ for a little bit. Because I know you have a lot of experience both coaching and playing, and like what are your perceptions on fairness and quality?
First off, I think it's fundamentally unfair to blanket a certain type of athlete as a certain type of athlete. And that may be women, that may be men, that may be boys ages 10 to 12. I don't think that there's necessarily a typical athlete. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about athletics is that it is somewhere that you can go to be yourself, to be part of a team, to learn these lessons that you're maybe not going to learn anywhere else at such a young age. I've coached kids as young as 3 years old on a soccer field. And then I've coached boys that are 18 years old and getting ready to go to college. And one thing that is phenomenally different about everybody is that you never run into the same athlete 2 times. Everyone always brings something different to the field. Their skill levels are different. Their bodies are different. Just because I'm going to coach a group of 16-year-old boys does not mean they're going to have muscles coming out of their ears and they're going to be super duper fast. Like I'm going to have anywhere from a kid who was doing really well to tie his shoes and get on the pitch to someone who is like, I've had this exact same soccer lesson taught by 6 different coaches the past 2 years, and there's nothing else you can teach me. Like athletes just in general are so diverse. And I think that when we make laws like the Mississippi Fairness Act, just comically anything but fair, we really limit ourselves, and we limit ourselves to what we let our kids get exposed to as well. And that's a disservice to them as well. One of the things that when I was researching different trans athletes, because I have not had the opportunity to play with anyone belonging to the community, so I had to do a little bit of research. One of the things that I hated seeing and that broke my heart the most was that the people who are really suffering, it's not the people you're trying to protect, the people who you're excluding. And so you have these wonderful athletes who happen to be trans, who are purposefully not going out for teams. They're purposefully not registering for races because they think they might win. They're only registering for the races that they know they'll lose, because then their status isn't called into question. Or they're not going into these sports teams, they're not trying out because, well, is it really going to be based on my skill level? Or is it going to be based on who I am as a person? And we're doing this to children. And that's not fair. And it's robbing everyone of a wonderful experience. And so just from an athletics perspective, y'all, this is garbage. This is something we've got to fix. Like it's 2021 and we're still talking about this. And so this is just, it's a bad excuse. It's a bad excuse for exclusion. This is not protecting anybody.
Thank you so much. I think there are a variety of jumping off points from that, which I sort of want to circle back because somebody had asked a question about sort of like hormone therapy and rules and sort of like okay, like if we allow transgender individuals to play on the team of their choice, sort of like how should that be regulated? Which I think sort of dovetails into questions about policing that we've talked about offline. So, I'll sort of leave that question open to the panel to address in their different ways. So I guess first, could somebody comment on sort of hormone therapy and like what exactly the rules are and what that entails? I'll leave it open to Paces, then transition into Isaiah, and then loop around to Jason.
Okay, so with hormone therapy, it's going to be different for kids versus adults. Over 18 is mostly what I deal with. Lee treats down to age 16. It's very difficult to find folks who will qualify for hormone therapy that are under 18 because you need parental consent and mental health letters of affirmation to get started under the age of 18. So having people on hormone therapy under the age of 18 is probably going to be more of a rarity right now in this state. For those who are 18 or over, or those who can actually find hormone therapy, in general, the effects of hormone therapy, I mean, let's be real. Nobody cares about trans men hormone therapy. They only care about trans women hormone therapy because everyone, like I mentioned before, everyone has that idea that there's going to be this advantage of, quote unquote, this guy who's going to go and play on the women's team, which is just asinine. But anyway, whenever these folks go on hormone therapy for feminization, they're going on estrogen therapy. Some of them are going on testosterone blockers. It depends on the kind of therapy you're doing. In general, if you're at my clinic, you're going to go on high dose estrogen therapy, which will suppress your testosterone in and of itself. But when you suppress someone's testosterone at or below the level of a cis woman's level of testosterone, what you see happen over the course of just a couple of years, and sometimes even just in the course of a few months, you will slowly see muscle atrophy, up to 25 to 30% muscle loss over the course of a couple of years. You will also see a decrease in their hemoglobin levels, which is that part of the blood, you need oxygen carrying capacity and whatnot. Whenever you decrease these hemoglobin levels down to that of cisgender women, you lose that endurance advantage that people are thinking, they're going to have higher oxygen carrying capacity and all this. Nope, that takes it away because testosterone helps produce extra blood cells. And whenever you take that extra testosterone level down, you lose that supposed advantage there. So here you have this person now that I would argue could actually become disadvantaged by hormone therapy. Because you've got someone here who may be larger of body, but now has had their musculature reduced and their endurance and oxygen carrying capacity reduced. And they now have to move this larger body in competition with cisgender women who haven't had to go on these medications and stupid things that give them side effects and whatnot. So this perceived advantage of trans women, especially those who are on hormone therapy, it's not founded in actual science. And then, as y'all mentioned before, with the young people, there's such a wide variety of where someone actually develops during their puberty. It's impossible to predict. You could have a 14-year-old cisgender girl who could completely demolish people on the boys' high school teams because they're just that much of an excellent athlete. And I just, comparing kids like that, it's so ridiculous to me. It just doesn't even compute, to be honest.
Great, thank you so much, Isaiah.
So in Mississippi, it is really difficult for someone under the age of 18, but in other states and some European countries, for people who are under the age of 18, usually the course of action would be hormone blockers. And through going through therapy, following WPATH, which is the World Physicians Association for Transgender Healthcare, following their directives, children under the age of 18 can begin hormone replacement therapy. I'm going to put it out there, sex change procedures, doesn't exist. Gender confirmation surgeries, those are pretty rare for someone under the age of 18. That's still something you have to wait for. But in terms of hormones, Like, Chloe Anderson was a volleyball player in California. Fallon Fox is a UFC fighter. Those are both trans women. And they both talk about how difficult it was to continue to compete and to be competitive at all in both of their sports because, like Stacey Pace is saying, like, their body just couldn't recover. Chloe Anderson talks a lot about how, like, just running, like, she's able to run and keep up with her teammates, no problem. And as she continued in her transition, like, go run a mile and lift. She's like, I just can't do this. Like, she couldn't recover for the next day. She loved playing volleyball, but eventually just couldn't because her body couldn't keep up with, like, the rigorousness of being a college athlete, which you can talk about.
Not hard at all. College athletics, super easy.
Anyone can do it.
Absolutely.
For trans men, in terms of being able to compete, the NCAA, like the Olympic Committee, both say for trans men, as soon as you declare that you identify as a man, you can compete. There's no requirements for you to take hormone replacement therapy. I would suggest, taking some testosterone to compete with the men. Just from my own experience, I ran 10 miles like recently, and I could not have done that before I transitioned. There's not a chance. For trans women, both the IOC and NCAA say that you need to be medically transitioning for at least a year and have levels that are underneath. Your testosterone levels have to be lower and nearly zero compared to what, like, cis women have. So cisgender women, that is one of our nice vocab words in case you don't know what that is. Cis women actually have higher testosterone levels than trans women who are trying to compete. And so again, like, for cis women to work out and to recover for tomorrow, it is much easier, honestly, than it is for a transgender woman who's medically transitioning. I think that's it. I think that's all I have for that.
Thanks. Jason?
I'll just add that we don't really engage in line drawing here. And I'll add that because it's difficult not to be arbitrary. And if we look historically at where, governing or regulatory bodies have sort of tried to draw that line, it's changed over time. I mean, it started with, sort of using secondary sex characteristics. So, the folks determining whether someone could be eligible to play would look and say, okay, you look like you passed the look test, right? There are, instances of athletes having to reveal their genitals, but any secondary sex characteristics that you would typically associate with men or with women. And then as science sort of developed or progressed, you started to see things like engaging in, some kind of medical transition. Of course, the medical science there has and continues to progress. That line is arbitrary, obviously, as we've heard here. That's just not available to some people. That's not accessible because there aren't the physicians and nurse practitioners and folks who are there. It's extremely expensive and insurance doesn't cover it. There's discrimination in the medical field. There are issues with racial disparities in healthcare. There are issues with rural disparities in healthcare, right? So that becomes a real arbitrary and inappropriate proxy, a way to draw the line. And then now we see sort of hormones, and particularly this obsession with levels of testosterone, 5 nanomoles per liter, then 10, and then, maybe we don't know, between 5 and 10. So I just say that to reinforce, the folks who are advancing now sex assigned at birth as the appropriate line drawing. It's arbitrary. It's not related to any particularized interest, and it's not connected to science. And so, our view is we shouldn't look at the ways in which regulatory bodies have attempted to draw that line, particularly when we're talking about the vast majority of athletes that these measures will affect. They aren't the elite competitors. They're not the folks who are at the Olympics or who are playing professional sports, because the vast majority of people who are playing sports are not going to get to that level anyway. And if you are transgender, the opportunity and availability for you to start and build to that kind of career participation really just fundamentally are not there. And so we always try to reframe this conversation about line drawing sort of back to the 99.9%, back to CJ's point about who is actually being harmed here and the actual purpose of team sports, particularly for young people, and the benefits that we lose by drawing this arbitrary line and essentially telling transgender women and girls that they can't participate.
And something that we've talked about offline is sort of this idea of like both gender policing and then these laws sort of bringing in sort of verification requirements. I'm curious, I almost want to move like from CJ to find out first, like, have you ever experienced or witnessed situations where it's, you know, like people will sort of call your womanhood into question, or others' womanhood into question based on how well you do in sports? And then like, I know there are some cases happening where folks are addressing this issue of policing. So.
Sure. So I'm a little bit more muscular than I heard you laugh. I heard.
Sorry.
So okay, soccer. Okay, I was a goalkeeper. So my body did not look like my teammates' bodies, because my body was not designed to run the 8 to 10 miles every game on purpose, because I didn't want to do that, so I became a goalkeeper. But I did not have the same body shape. I didn't have the same workouts. Like when we went into the weight room, my weight that I had to hit was substantially more than everybody else's, because they had to be able to run everywhere all the time for 90 minutes. And I had to be able to run up to 18 yards 3 or 4 times a game. Like that was just my fitness level. So if anyone was going to be picked on for their body, it would probably have been me. Thankfully that didn't happen, because I would have cried a lot. But you look at athletes like Serena Williams, because of course that's who I'm going to choose. Like, hello, a cisgender female. Okay, if she can do that with her body, what are we worried about? Like, what are we worried about? Women in sports are not a group of people that need to be protected from biological men who have decided one day that they're not good enough for boys sports teams, so I'm just going to be a girl today. That is not a thing that happens. And it's funny because it sounds ridiculous coming from me, but that's literally what the argument is. Like, that's it. And it's completely ignorant to think that someone would put themselves through what has to go on to medically transition just so that they can play and be the best. It's ridiculous. That's why we don't see it happening. It's a theoretical argument that's just, we don't see that. I mean, we just don't.
Yeah, and Jason, I know, well, Jason and Isaiah, and I know we've also had this conversation too, Sarah, about like intersectionality and policing in this area. Want to go ahead, Jason?
Yeah, I'll start by sort of talking about a feature of Senate Bill 2536, and actually a feature of the 8 other measures that passed around the country this past year, and 1 outstanding in Texas. 12 were actually introduced, and it is this idea of third-party enforcement, right? And so what these bills have done is the legislature and the executive who signed these bills into law, they've kind of thrown the rock of discrimination and then hid the hand of responsibility, and created enforcement measures that essentially create financial incentives for anyone to sort of challenge a trans woman or girl's participation. Right now, I grew up in South Carolina. So getting proud. Football town, USA. I mean, I grew up around sports, right? And how many folks in here have been to a high school, college sporting event? I mean, 90% of the time, fans are not super kind, right? I mean, that's an environment that is just ripe for a lot of really harmful stuff to happen, particularly when you dangle the potential for a few $1,000s for challenging someone's ability to participate, for challenging someone's fundamental identity. And so you know, this idea of policing is put off onto a public that is not well informed about transgender people, and not only not well informed, but may harbor some high degree of bias because of their ignorance and because of what these same, you know, leaders have told them are threats to them and their children and this idea of women's sports generally. And so who do you think is going to be targeted? Who do you think is most likely going to bear the brunt of the citizen enforcement provisions? And so I do think it's important to think about who has been policed before, whose bodies have been seen as other, whose bodies has that discrimination and bias been located in historically, and think about the compounding effects of that historical bias and discrimination with now the financial incentive of, you know, tens of thousands of dollars potentially. So I always want to sort of talk about that as a feature because, you know, not only is, again, the state, you know, codifying this discrimination in state law, but it's also providing a vehicle to turn classmate against classmate, neighbor against neighbor, community member against community member. And I think reinforcing some really harmful stereotypes about certain kinds of bodies and their threat to our safety.
Does anyone else on the panel want to add on anything? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Like to put it like just like directly in front of you, this like directly impacts like Black women. Like those are the bodies that are going to be policed the most often because like that's already what happens. Serena Williams is an amazing example. Like she is a goddess, okay? Like she's done it all and she's perfect. But we continue, it's okay, you can agree. We continue to like still say like, oh, she's a man, like all this stuff, even though the evidence is clear that she's not, right? And it's like when we look at now, let's like go down to the high school and the middle school level, we're going to look at bodies that are different than like the majority's body. Look at everyone around you right now. I'm so serious. Look at around you. The majority is white people. White bodies are going to be the norm. And anyone who doesn't match like a white ideal is going to have a strange body that is really easy to throw into a bus to get a couple $1,000s. And what that means is it's misogynoir. It's something that specifically that's going to impact Black women. Caster Semenya is an amazing athlete. And because she has a natural advantage, she has been put under a lot of really strict guidelines, has to take medication to be able to compete. And other women around the world as well, other Black women, it's happening to them. Like we're specifically marginalizing groups that are already marginalized in the name of like, we'll save you. Women's athletes don't need saving. Women's sports don't need saving. It's wild. We also have to think about like natural differences. When your body produces like half the amount of lactic acid, you're amazing. And let's like write a lot of articles about you and applaud you. But because you have like a natural endogenous like level of testosterone that's higher and you may be faster than the average person and you're a woman doing it, it's not okay. Usain Bolt has never been questioned for being so fast. Great job for him. But if a Black woman does the same thing, we need to like test her, question her, make her take medicine. Like it affects all women overall, like this policing, but we also need to focus on like this specifically is going to continue to target Black women.
So there was a question that had come through sort of geared at advocacy efforts against acts like this. I know, Sarah, you were very involved. So if you want to talk a little bit about your involvement in advocacy, and then other folks on the panel, they're, you know, like Isaiah or Jason, or even like the Paces have ideas, like we'd love to hear more about sort of what advocacy looks like and in a lot of different ways, like litigation, policy, or otherwise.
Wow, yeah, it's kind of loaded. For me, I think generally speaking in advocacy, something I talked about this morning with the group was that people in general don't know what rights, avenues, remedies, all these things that they can pursue, right? So that's one of my goals, is to provide this awareness Because I've said this multiple times in multiple contexts. I shouldn't have to be a third-year law student to understand what my rights are, what the bars are for knowing if discrimination happened, for knowing who to talk to if I have an issue. There's just something inherently wrong with our system. And you've got people that are marginalized, as Isaiah mentioned, and even worse, when you have socioeconomic disadvantage, when you have, they're already an outside person, they're not going to know where to go, who to talk to, what to do. And so my level of advocacy right now is on interacting with people where they are and finding out how I can point them in the right direction or help them myself. And right now that's been looking like helping with name changes through the chancery courts, working on gender marker changes, legally working on putting them, in contact with people, because it's sad in Mississippi, especially, and this is probably true in other parts of the country, where I've had people that have contacted me and they said, you seem to be becoming the expert in this field. And I'm thinking that's a problem, right? When you have a third-year law student that people are like, I'm getting phone calls and emails and text all the time. And so I know there's a void there. And I know that there's a lot of people in the shadows that are affected by whether it's the 2536 or 1523, the law was passed a number of years ago, or barriers to any other kind of access. There's people out there in the shadows that don't make themselves known because they don't know how. And so that's where my level of advocacy is at this point. I don't know if anybody wants to share anything else.
I'll share with over here. As healthcare providers, our advocacy, it really can be multidimensional, really. So just for example, I'll have patients of mine or people who aren't patients of mine contact us asking us, various questions about hormone therapy, being trans, all this other stuff. But I can also easily write them a letter that they can give to their employer that explains their transgender status and what it means and how they could be best accommodated. I have little templates for this because I've been asked so many times that now all I have to do is plug in the patient's name, their date of birth, just their basic information, sign it. There you go. Now they have something to present to their employer, because a lot of employers have literally no clue what to do when someone comes to them and says, hey, I'd really like to be able to use the restroom over there, but they're telling me I can't. So something very simple like that, writing a letter. I've written letters for name change, gender marker changes, employers to allow people to use, their preferred name on their name badge, use the restroom of the gender they identify best with, and just other such things. It's very useful to have the healthcare provider community kind of a little bit more knowledgeable so that they can help out too, because they don't have to be directly involved in hormone therapy. All they need to do is just say, hey, this is a thing, and sign their name to help out. So that's kind of what our side does, besides just general education and showing up for, events like this so that we can hopefully, clarify some myths and whatnot. But anyway, so that's our side of the advocacy.
Can I make a follow-up statement there, and why the spectrum is so important in Mississippi is I moved here from New York State, and I tried to do my best to navigate insurance and doctors and that type of thing. And so I called all the doctors that were on my insurance, coverage list, and I found a clinic that had an endocrinologist, and I called them ahead of time and I said, I need someone to help me with my HRT. They're an endocrinologist office. I figured they'd know what that meant. And I said, is that something you can help me with? They said, yeah, sure, come on, we'll make you an appointment. So I made an appointment, and I showed up there and I was in the exam room and they saw my prescriptions, and they're like, okay, are you a diabetic? I'm like, no. Do you suffer from this disease? No. And what I realized they were doing, and I think Stacy might have picked up on it right away, they were running through their mind why I was on hormones. That because maybe I was diabetic, maybe I was this, maybe I was that. And I didn't make it easy for them, right? I said, I'm gonna let them kind of struggle through this. And so at the end, this nurse practitioner, she said, she's like, oh, okay. She asked me a few clarifying questions. I'm like, okay, they got it now. So she went out of the room, went to talk to the endocrinologist, and then she came back and she said, oh, okay, well, here's what we've got to do. We're not going to be able to help you here. We're going to have to send you to a specialist. And that would be, the nearest specialist is in Memphis. And I'm like, okay. And my thought after leaving there, and I had to drive, as we know in Mississippi, access to doctors, access to general health care, the nearest one I found that my insurance would cover was 2 hours from my house. So I'm driving 2 hours to a clinic so I could be seen in person. And she tells me Memphis, which was going to be a 4-hour drive one way for me. And my thought is like the solution for healthcare in Mississippi is to send people to another state. That to me is fundamentally wrong. And so that's why the Spectrum and there's a clinic in Jackson, I think is so important because of this access, right? You already have people that don't have insurance. They don't know how to navigate the system. They, don't get me started on insurance. But that you have, it's not like you can just go to any doctor, right? And because the doctors know very well that they can refuse service. That's a given. If a transgender person walks in for non-emergency medical care, the doctor can do what that doctor did and say, oh no, we can't help you here. Right. So, okay. So then what do I do? Where do I go? And that's where definitely Spectrum fills that need. And there aren't that many options here in Mississippi.
Go ahead.
So my form of, I guess, advocacy is so I work here on campus and I have chosen the route of doing a lot of educating and convincing. So they're trying to work with what we have on campus to provide for students. We have a full-fledged health service, and any doctor who studied primary care can prescribe hormone replacement therapy. Don't ever let anyone tell you differently. We also have a full lab here. So working to get those professionals to know that, and then working also to make sure people outside of the community know what's going on. My voice only goes so far, Sarah's voice only goes so far, and we shouldn't have to do the work for ourselves to exist. People don't know that the state of Mississippi doesn't have a trans healthcare ban unless you're a state employee. Hello, I work for the state. I don't have health insurance, and that's a huge part of my pay package. That's a problem. People don't know that. So I make sure that in the work that I do, and I see you raising your hand.
So, can you say that again? What is the ban?
So there's a ban. There's the only trans healthcare ban in the state of Mississippi is if you work for the state. So state insurance will not allow a state employee to get any transgender healthcare coverage at all. Nothing. And if you don't work for the state, the state covers $360 or $380 worth of your monthly healthcare plan, and that's part of your package. That means that I'm losing $4,000 plus a year because they're covering my health insurance. So I'm already underpaid, but then I'm extra underpaid because I should technically have to go out and get extra insurance just to get coverage. That's a problem. So I educate. I make sure people know that exists, that's a problem. I make sure that when I do trainings, people know that our State Bill 2536 is going to make it difficult or can make it difficult for people to participate in intramural sports, for them to have housing that makes sense for them. The IHL says that you have to have gendered housing. They also have in there though, that you can request an exemption. People don't know that. I can say a lot of things, but my job is to do the gay stuff on campus. I say that a lot, sorry. That's my job. So it doesn't matter when I get angry about it. So I have to have someone else. I have to have students know and have them be the people that have those conversations. My voice, my whole job is to be the angry queer person on campus. And so really it's someone else has to be angry for me, for us, for all of our students. I tell people when I work on campus, there is no building that you ever walk into, no classroom, no department that doesn't have someone there that like works with me, that belongs to my community and that I'm here to represent. And so all of the issues all the time are always my problems. Like everyone should care.
Just a quick follow-up on a local level. I've been contacted by many students, university students, who the current issue we're working on is student IDs. Because if you can imagine yourself, you have an ID that may say John, and you show up at your class and you present as Jane, right? And so your professor, your classmates, your professor stands in the front of class and calls out the roll, and the professor calls, is John here? And you have Jane that's like, I mean, think of the anxiety and you have to out yourself every time you go into a new class. You have to out yourself with your classmates. And so we're working through some hurdles, but those are the type of issues on an everyday level that I'm working on.
Which I think that's a really good segue, because as we're running to our last few minutes, one of the things that I wanted folks to address was like, I know that today was sort of based around athletics, but there are often, like you mentioned, really important issues that really intersect with that issue, like whether it's housing or medical care or something else. And I know, like, some folks have asked questions about issues about fear and bathrooms and where can you change and things like that. So what do you sort of want to leave audience members with, whether it's important related issues, or like really how do we seek out really this ideal of fairness and equality more broadly? I'll start with Jason, and then I'll go into there again.
That's a big question. But I'll say this, because it's in part response to what Isaiah just mentioned. And that's our responsibility as cisgender people, to think about this as our issue. Because we are cisgender, we occupy a position of privilege. And even though in other identities we may not, in this particular identity we do. And so it is our responsibility to find a way to be co-conspirators, to use that privilege in order to change the dynamics of power. I always tell people, Black folks ain't gonna fix white supremacy. Like, white people need to get around the table or whatever it is that y'all do. and like, you know what I'm saying? Because like that, so when my white friends are always asking me questions, I'm like, well, what do you talk about at the white meetings? Because I'm not there. Like, I don't come to those, right? Like, so this is the same thing as a cis person. Look, I litigate, right? That's what I do. And litigation is real harm reduction. It's not getting at the fundamental disimbalance of power. Now, my colleague Rob Hill over here, raise your hand, the maestro of Mississippi, as I call him. That's the person you really want to get down into how you exercise political power at the state level, collectively and strategically. There is an opportunity to do that. But all of this stuff, whether it's name changes, whether it's just showing up and being there for trans non-binary people, educating yourself about the issues, starting very small, but there is something that is your responsibility to do. And, our democracy and our freedoms aren't about a few people doing a lot. It's about everybody doing a little bit. And so I think I would just leave you with, it may feel like a mountain to climb. We have a lot of ground to cover in a place here where it's going to be challenging and difficult, but we can't leave these folks. We can't leave my 13-year-old client who's a soccer goalkeeper. We can't leave them and their families and their parents just out there on their own to try to not only figure out and navigate what their rights are, but then to have to fight and defend to have them restored. These issues are our issues. Our Constitution is our Constitution. And if it doesn't protect everybody, it doesn't protect anybody. So I would just encourage you, particularly the future lawyers in the room, to really think about your responsibility as a guardian of liberty. I don't care what kind of law you go out and practice professionally, but you occupy a particular space in this country and you have some privilege to actually do something about it. So just use it.
Actually, I'm gonna quickly call on CJ. Let's go ahead with that big question about sort of what do you want to leave the audience with, or thoughts on equality on this greater scale.
Right. So, and I've said this a couple of times, but I want to reemphasize the fact that I don't think that this whole narrative is to protect women. I think it is to exclude people that are different, that maybe we do not understand as a whole. I'm saying that as a lawmaker, not as like fundamentally everybody here. We don't understand. But like, this is an exclusionary thing that we're doing. This is not a protection thing. However, for anybody who's on the call, anybody that's in here that does and is truly interested in protecting women, I have a short list. Facilities management. That's a good place to start. Maybe don't make us play on fields that don't have grass, that have broken bottles, that don't have a fence, that don't have a locker room. When I was in college, I had to walk half a mile from my locker room to my field, and then I had to walk half a mile from my field to my locker room. I played for a Division I SEC school. Equal pay. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look up any soccer player ever that's alive. Equal sponsorships. Do not throw your money only at male athletics. And equal game times. This is something so simple as the fact that women are so tired of being the opening act for men's high school soccer or men's high school sports. Maybe one day I want to play, or I want my kid to play somewhere on a Friday night. And I have a daughter that maybe doesn't want to play football. These are things that we can do. Unfortunately, we're not going to do these things because they cost money. Instead, we're just going to exclude people and say that we're protecting women. Stop using women as your guinea pig to exclude people. We don't need protecting, but we could use equality as well.
And I think that's a really awesome place to end.
Woo!
We are forced to evacuate. Y'all have to leave this classroom, there's a classroom. But you might be in the hallway for a little bit.
You can stay.
Okay. All right, you guys have to get
That's how I started my story. I didn't know that.
That's the worst. I had, because of horrible facilities, we had a visit, 18-yard box sometimes, and I separated my shoulders from the game.
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, thankfully I popped back independent, but like, the men's team did. The men's team had fresh grass. It was always all right.
Hey, how are you?
I told you I would make it.
I know, I'm so glad to see you here. I'm glad you're here. Wow. How are you?
Good. Where in South Carolina are you from? Florence.
All right.
Josh.
Are you a law student?
Yeah. I'm in my It's very interesting. South Carolina to hear. I see a lot of similarities.
What you're saying was like all the things I was like, especially small world, I was like, that's like a lot of time.
There's a lot of like, That's super fun that you're